The country prayed for her return, but the real story was just beginning. Sherri Papini lived in what looked like a picture-perfect life. She had 2 children, a doting husband named Keith, and a home in a peaceful Northern California neighborhood. By all accounts, she was upbeat, charismatic, and community-oriented. On November 2nd, 2016, Sherri went out for a late morning jog and vanished. Keith grew concerned when she didn't pick up the kids from daycare. He used the Find My iPhone app and traced her phone to a rural bike path. It was lying on the ground, alongside her earbuds, clumps of her blonde hair, and no sign of a struggle.
911, what is your emergency? CHP transfer. Keith is on the line. Hello, can I help you?
Hello? Yeah, I just got home from work, and my wife wasn't there, which is unusual, and my kids should have been there by now from, daycare. So I was like, oh, maybe she went on a walk. I couldn't find her, so I called the daycare to see what time she picked up the kids. The kids were never picked up, so I got freaked out, so I hit, the Find My iPhone app thing, and it said that it showed her phone, at our end of our driveway. We don't have really good service.
Okay.
Not the end of our driveway, but the end of our street. So I just drove down there, and I saw her phone with her headphones because she started running again. And I found her phone, and it's got, hair ripped out of it, in the headphones. So I'm, totally freaking out, thinking, somebody, grabbed her.
Okay, what's your address?
Redding.
Okay, what's your last name?
Yes. Papini, Papini.
Police launched a statewide search. Helicopters sent dogs. Volunteers. Flyers were stapled to trees. Keith gave interviews on national television, pleading for help. He told Good Morning America he had received strands of Sherri's hair in the mail, along with a chilling note. The case exploded. Social media lit up. It echoed the high-profile disappearances of Lacey Peterson and Natalie Holloway. A beautiful blonde woman, a tight-knit family, a mysterious vanishing. But behind the scenes, investigators were already puzzled. There were no witnesses, no credible surveillance footage, and the phone, oddly, was placed neatly on the ground, not flung or damaged. Still, the search continued. For 22 days, the public waited with bated breath. Then, just before Thanksgiving, a driver spotted something on the side of the highway, 140 miles from where Sherri disappeared. It was her.
911 emergency, what are you reporting?
Hi, I have an emergency. There's a lady on the side of the road needing help. She's chained up, her vision's blurry, and she needs an ambulance.
You see her chained up?
Yes, her name is Sherri Papini.
Emaciated, bruised, her wrist zip-tied, a branding mark seared into her shoulder. She was shivering, incoherent, but alive. And her story was almost too horrifying to believe. Keith, in a panic, begged for her safe return in front of a national audience. He choked up during interviews. "Bring my wife home," he pleaded. His raw emotion struck a nerve across the country. Theories exploded online. Some thought it was a random kidnapping. Others believed it was a targeted abduction. Podcasts picked it up. Crime forums spun wild scenarios. A reward fund began to grow. And then, just as momentum started to fade, she came back. When police arrived, Sherri was barely able to speak. She claimed she had been abducted by 2 Hispanic women who spoke Spanish and wore masks. She said they beat her, starved her, and chained her to a piece of furniture. She claimed they cut her hair, branded her shoulder, and threatened to kill her if she tried to escape. The media exploded. CNN, Dr. Phil, 2020. America couldn't get enough of this story. She was hailed as America's supermom. Her husband Keith broke down on Good Morning America describing her condition. Her signature long blonde hair had been chopped off. She was emaciated, bruised, covered in burns and rashes. Donations, though, poured in. A GoFundMe raised over $49,000 to help the family recover. Well-wishers sent letters, supplies, and cash. But behind the scenes, investigators were skeptical. Her descriptions of the kidnappers were vague and inconsistent. She refused to sit with the police sketch artist. Her story changed slightly from interview to interview. There was no surveillance footage, no tire marks, no fingerprints, no trace of the vehicle she claimed she had used. And then there was the branding. Doctors noted that the brand on her shoulder looked deliberate, carefully placed, and surprisingly well healed for someone who had supposedly been released. Still, authorities held back. They didn't want to publicly accuse a potential victim of lying, but the cracks were widening. Investigators quietly began tracking her movements, checking her phone records, and reviewing any DNA collected during her hospital evaluation. They found a partial DNA profile on her clothing, a man's DNA, but it didn't belong to her husband. That was the moment when everything changed. Hospital staff began to question what they were seeing. Sherri was thin, yes, but not dangerously underweight. Her injuries were real, but appeared older than 24 hours. And the branding? It was done with calculated precision, almost like someone had practiced or planned it. She had no broken bones, no untreated wounds, and when asked about how she was fed or where she was kept, her answers were vague. Behaviorally, she was strangely calm. One nurse described her demeanor as emotionally flat, not what they expected from someone who had just endured 3 weeks of torture. Meanwhile, the FBI was analyzing the mysterious male DNA. If it didn't belong to any known suspect, and it wasn't from a random attacker. As they've dug into Sherri's background, they discovered something else. Several years earlier, she had been accused of faking other incidents. An ex-boyfriend once told police that she had harmed herself and blamed others. Former co-workers recalled strange stories of attention-seeking behavior. It all started to paint a new picture, not of a victim, but of a manipulator. And the man whose DNA was found on her clothing? He wasn't a stranger. He was someone from her past. The mysterious DNA finally led agents to a man named James Reyes, Sherri's ex-boyfriend from years earlier. When they knocked on his door in Southern California, he didn't even try to deny it. Reyes told the FBI everything. Sherri had contacted him months before she disappeared. She said she was being abused by Keith. She said she needed to escape. She asked him to come pick her up, and he did. He drove her 600 miles south to his apartment. There was no kidnapping, no chains, no masked woman. For 3 weeks, they lived quietly. Reyes worked during the day. Sherri stayed inside doing puzzles and watching TV. She even cut her own hair. The bruises, she caused them herself. The brand, he said she asked him to do it using a wood-burning tool from his garage. Reyes was stunned when he saw the news coverage. He said he believed she just needed a break from her life, but then she returned home and claimed she had been kidnapped. I had no idea she was going to lie like that, he told investigators. The FBI now had DNA, text messages, and testimony from Reyes, all contradicting Sherri's story. But she didn't back down. When confronted, she denied everything. She instead insisted that Reyes was lying, that she had been kidnapped, that she had no idea how his DNA got on her. Agents kept digging. They found burner phones. They found notes she had written while missing. They even traced old Amazon purchases that had matched items she claimed had been used during her abduction. The case was unraveling fast, and the public was stunned. People who had donated money, volunteered in the search, and followed her story religiously now felt betrayed. The media coverage shifted instantly. Once hailed as a hero, she was now painted as a fraud, a narcissist, a con artist. Even Keith began to question everything. He stopped doing interviews, he filed for legal separation, and later for full divorce. But Sherri stayed silent. In August 2020, agents finally brought Sherri in for a formal interview. They showed her the DNA. They read her messages to James Reyes. They asked her point blank, had she faked it all? Still, she denied everything. Her voice shook. She clutched her arms. She claimed the trauma had clouded her memory, that Reyes was obsessed with her, that he must have found a way to plant the evidence. But by now, the FBI had something even more damning. They had tracked her movements before and after the so-called kidnapping. They had evidence she had been planning the disappearance for weeks. And then came the final nail. Investigators discovered that during the time she was missing, she and Keith had received over $30,000 from the California Victim Compensation Board and the GoFundMe account. Money meant for recovery was used to pay off credit card debt and personal expenses. This wasn't just a hoax, it was fraud. And soon the case would no longer be a mystery. It would become a federal crime. On March 3rd, 2022, federal prosecutors dropped the hammer. Sherri Papini was arrested and charged with mail fraud and for making false statements to a federal officer. The woman who once captured America's sympathy was now in handcuffs. The public reaction was explosive. News outlets ran split-screen stories before and after. Influencers and talk show hosts who once defended her now called her the delusional. True crime podcasts that had covered her disappearance issued corrections and updates with a much darker tone. Sherri Papini had become a symbol of manipulation, media gullibility, and racial scapegoating, all rolled into one. And in April 2022, she finally confessed. In a plea deal, Papini admitted that the entire kidnapping had been a lie. She confirmed that she staged the abduction with James Reyes. She harmed herself to support the story. She collected victim compensation knowing it was fraudulent. Her statement read, "I am deeply ashamed of myself. I am sorry to the many people who suffered because of me. But for many, it was too little too late." Keith filed for divorce and requested sole custody of the children. He called her actions cruel and calculated and said she had shattered the trust of an entire country. Prosecutors asked for 8 months in prison. Her lawyers asked for home confinement, citing her mental health. But the judge wasn't moved. She said she was kidnapped, tortured, and left for dead. But it was all an act, and now the mask had finally slipped. In September 2022, Sherri Papini was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 36 months of supervised release. The judge called her actions cold and calculated, emphasizing the lasting damage of her lies. Not just to her family and community, but to real victims of violence who were often doubted. The fallout didn't stop there. The California Victim Compensation Board demanded repayment. GoFundMe refunded donors. Her story was stripped from sympathetic coverage and placed squarely in the criminal deception category. But even as she prepared to serve her sentence, she never gave a full explanation for why she did it. Not to her family, not to the public, not even to the court. Victims' rights groups condemned her actions publicly. They said her lies made it harder for real survivors to be believed. That every fake abduction cast doubt on the next real one, and that her false accusations against Hispanic women added fuel to dangerous stereotypes. One advocate put it bluntly, she didn't just lie, she took up space that belonged to real victims. Even years after sentencing, her case continues to be referenced in law enforcement training programs, used as an example of how to identify inconsistencies in high-profile victim reports. As for her children, Keith said he hoped they would one day understand the truth and not grow up living inside their mother's fantasy. He said this was not just betrayal of trust, it was betrayal of motherhood. When she was finally taken into custody, Papini didn't cry. She just looked at the floor. She didn't speak. She didn't apologize. She just walked out of the courtroom and disappeared behind the bars of a federal facility. Sherri Papini served just over a year in federal custody. She was released to a halfway house and eventually transitioned into supervised probation. She now lives under the radar. No media interviews, no apology tour, no explanation. The world moved on, but her story lingers in public memory. Not because it was a shocking crime, but because it was a carefully staged illusion. She weaponized sympathy. she manipulated the media, she exploited systems meant to help real victims. And in doing so, she didn't just hurt her family or her town, she hurt trust. Every time a woman goes missing, her name echoes in the background. Whispers of, "Is this real?" Doubts, fueled by one lie too many. To this day, no one knows exactly why she did it. Some speculate she was craving attention. Others say she was mentally unwell, overwhelmed by pressures of domestic life. Some believe it was a desperate attempt to reconnect with an old flame and escape reality. But in the end, the reasons don't matter as much as the consequences. Her case changed how missing persons reported or handled, how media covers disappearances, how donations are scrutinized, how victims are believed. Papini's hoax didn't just damage her family, it damaged the next person who truly needs help and might not get it in time. In a world where truth fights for airtime against drama, the Sherri Papini story is a grim reminder. The loudest story isn't always the truest one, and sometimes the biggest villain wears the mask of a victim. So the next time you see a headline that grips the nation, pause, ask questions, and remember, trust is fragile. Because one lie doesn't just destroy the liar, it leaves scars on everyone who believed. For more stories like this, subscribe.